somewhere in Tunisia, early 1943. A column of dust rises over a captured supply depot where a group of German officers stands in silence around a small, unimpressive vehicle. The machine before them has no armor, no heavy weaponry, nothing that would suggest it belongs on a battlefield. It sits there, squat and bare, with stamped steel wheels and a simple canvas top. One of the officers, a logistics major who had worked in German automotive factories before the war, circles the vehicle slowly. He runs his gloved hand across the hood, pops it open, and stares at the engine beneath. A 2.2-liter four-cylinder block, a basic, utilitarian, almost primitive by the standards of Bavarian engineering, and yet this officer knows something that his superiors are only beginning to understand. This small, crude machine represents a philosophy of war that Germany cannot defeat. He has seen the reports from the Eastern Front, where entire panzer divisions grind to a halt waiting for fuel that never arrives. He has read the dispatches from North Africa, where Rommel's Afrika Korps runs out of ammunition, while supply convoys struggle through sand that swallows their vehicles whole. And now he stands before the answer to a question the German High Command has refused to ask. Not which nation builds the best weapons, but which nation can deliver those weapons where they need to go, when they need to arrive, in quantities that overwhelm the enemy. The major closes the hood and turns to his fellow officers. His assessment, according to later accounts, was blunt. The Americans, he tells them, have solved problems we did not know we had, and that perhaps is where our war was lost. If you are fascinated by how seemingly small decisions shape the outcome of massive conflicts, this channel exists to explore those moments. Subscribe now and join the journey through the most compelling stories of military history. The vehicle that captured the attention of German officers across every theater of the Second World War was the Willys MB, known universally as the Jeep. It emerged from a frantic design competition in 1940, when the United States Army recognized a critical gap in its equipment roster. The military needed a light reconnaissance vehicle that could go anywhere, do anything, and be produced in numbers that staggered the imagination. The original specifications were almost absurd. The Army wanted a vehicle weighing no more than 1,300 pounds, capable of carrying a 600-pound payload, with four-wheel drive and a wheelbase under 75 inches. American manufacturers looked at these requirements and declared them impossible. And yet within weeks, the Bantam Car Company, followed by Willys Overland and Ford, delivered prototypes that would eventually evolve into one of the most significant machines in military history. The Jeep that German generals would come to admire was not a sophisticated piece of engineering by European standards. It used leaf springs, the most basic suspension design available. Its body was stamped from flat steel panels with no elegant curves or complex shapes. The Go Devil engine produced 60 horsepower, modest compared to the power plants German engineers were cramming into their tanks and half-tracks. But the Jeep had something German vehicles lacked entirely. It was designed for logistics from the very first sketch on the drawing board. Every component was chosen not for performance alone, but for ease of manufacture, simplicity of repair, and interchangeability across hundreds of thousands of identical units. A mechanic who learned to fix one Jeep could fix any Jeep. A part pulled from a destroyed vehicle in France would fit perfectly into a Jeep operating in the Philippines. This was not an accident. This was the American doctrine of industrial warfare made manifest in steel and rubber. The numbers alone reveal the gulf between American and German production philosophy. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced approximately 640,000 quarter-ton Jeeps. Willys Overland built more than 360,000 units. Ford produced nearly 280,000 more. To put this in perspective, Germany's total production of the Kübelwagen, the Jeep's closest equivalent, reached approximately 50,000 vehicles over the entire war. The Americans built more Jeeps in 1943 alone than Germany managed to produce Kübelwagens in 6 years of trying. But even these statistics fail to capture the true advantage the Jeep provided. The vehicle was not merely produced in vast quantities, it was designed to be shipped efficiently across oceans, assembled quickly in forward areas, and maintained by soldiers with minimal training using tools available in any village smithy. German engineers who examined captured Jeeps were confronted with a paradox. The vehicle was technically inferior to the Kübelwagen in several meaningful ways. The Volkswagen-based design used an air-cooled engine that could not overheat or freeze. Its independent suspension provided a smoother ride over rough terrain. The limited slip differential, an advanced feature first developed for racing cars, allowed it to maintain traction even when one wheel lost grip. On paper, the Kübelwagen should have been the superior vehicle, but paper does not win wars. Logistics wins wars. And in the realm of logistics, the Kübelwagen was a disaster waiting to happen. Its 22.5 horsepower engine, detuned from the civilian Volkswagen's 25 horsepower for reliability, simply could not pull heavy loads. A Jeep could tow artillery pieces, trailers loaded with ammunition, or disabled vehicles. A Kübelwagen struggled with a radio set and 2 officers, and the underpowered engine meant German commanders had to dedicate multiple vehicles to tasks a single Jeep could accomplish, multiplying fuel consumption, maintenance requirements, and the number of trained drivers needed. The fundamental problem with German vehicle production went far deeper than any individual design. The Reich's automotive industry before the war was fragmented, competitive, and utterly unsuited for mass military production. German factories produced an astonishing variety of vehicle types, each with its own unique components, repair procedures, and spare parts requirements. A Wehrmacht infantry division might operate vehicles from a dozen different manufacturers, with interchangeable parts between them being essentially non-existent. When a truck broke down in Russia, the mechanics could not simply grab parts from another disabled vehicle unless it happened to be the exact same make and model. They had to wait for spare parts to arrive through a supply chain that was already stretched beyond breaking. This stood in stark contrast to American standardization. The United States military ruthlessly eliminated variety from its vehicle fleet, concentrating production on a handful of designs that could be manufactured by multiple companies using identical specifications. A Ford-built Jeep was mechanically identical to a Willys-built Jeep. The 2.5-ton trucks that carried supplies across Europe came primarily from a single standardized design, the GMC Seek KW, with more than 560,000 produced during the war. The horse. When historians discuss German logistics in the Second World War, they inevitably arrive at the horse, and this is where the true scale of German logistical failure becomes apparent. Despite the carefully cultivated image of the Wehrmacht as a modern, mechanized force, the German military relied heavily on horses throughout the entire war. Each infantry division required thousands of horses and thousands of soldiers dedicated solely to caring for those animals. A 1944-type German infantry division operated with approximately 4,600 horses, pulling some 1,400 horse-drawn vehicles. Against this, the division possessed only about 600 motor vehicles and 150 motorcycles. The only fully motorized units in the traditional German infantry divisions were reconnaissance and anti-tank elements. Everything else, from artillery to supply wagons, moved at the speed of walking horses. Hard-working horses required up to 12 pounds of grain daily, plus water, grooming, and veterinary care. The fodder alone consumed a major portion of German supply trains, creating a vicious cycle where supplies meant for combat troops were diverted to feed the animals that carried supplies to combat troops. The American solution to tactical mobility was the Jeep, and its integration into every level of military operations transformed the way commanders could fight. Wehrmacht generals interviewed after the war by United States Army historian Hugh Cole stated that they admired the Jeep more than any other piece of American equipment. They called it the Wonder Wagon. This was not sentimentality or politeness toward their captors. This was professional respect born from watching the Jeep do things that German tactical doctrine had never anticipated. Medical personnel used Jeeps to evacuate wounded soldiers from forward positions, moving casualties to aid stations faster than any horse-drawn ambulance could manage. Artillery forward observers rode Jeeps to positions where they could direct fire, then relocated before a counter-battery fire could find them. Commanders drove to forward units, assessed situations personally, made decisions, and drove back to implement those decisions immediately. The Jeep filled a gap in German military thinking, the space between individual soldiers on foot and heavy vehicles like trucks and half-tracks. It was a gap German planners had not recognized until American Jeeps demonstrated what was possible. This is the moment to pause and reflect on how seemingly minor equipment decisions cascaded into strategic catastrophe. The principles we explore in these documentaries, the intersection of technology, logistics, and human decision-making, shape the outcomes of history in ways that deserve deeper examination. If you find value in understanding these connections, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this content with others who appreciate military history. When German forces first encountered American Jeeps in North Africa, the initial reaction was contempt mixed with curiosity. Propaganda had convinced many German soldiers that American equipment was soft, designed for comfort rather than combat, the product of a decadent civilization that had forgotten how to fight. The Jeep appeared to confirm these prejudices. It had no doors. Its canvas top offered no protection from weather or shrapnel. The seats were utilitarian slabs of cushioning mounted directly over the axles, guaranteeing a punishing ride. German soldiers who captured their first Jeeps expected to find the vehicles disappointing in actual use. Instead, they discovered something that challenged everything they believed about proper military engineering. The four-wheel drive system meant the Jeep could operate in weather and terrain conditions that immobilized German vehicles. Its mechanical reliability meant fewer breakdowns during critical missions. The simple design meant that even minimally trained mechanics could perform field repairs using basic tools. German units operating captured Jeeps reported significantly improved tactical mobility. Reconnaissance teams could penetrate deeper into Allied lines, moving faster and covering more ground than was possible with Kübelwagens, or even worse, the horse-drawn carts that most German units relied upon for transport. The intelligence value was enormous. A German reconnaissance team in a captured Jeep could pass for American at a distance, moving closer to Allied positions before being identified. This advantage became so significant that by late 1944, the German High Command authorized Operation Greif, a bold and ultimately desperate plan to use captured American vehicles and uniforms to sow chaos behind Allied lines during the Ardennes offensive. The operation was the brainchild of Adolf Hitler himself, who believed that German commandos disguised as Americans could capture bridges over the Meuse River before they could be destroyed. The plan called for a special unit under the command of Otto Skorzeny, the famous commando who had rescued Mussolini from captivity a year earlier. But the operation was crippled from the start by a fundamental problem that no amount of bravery could overcome. Germany simply did not have enough captured American equipment to carry out the plan. Skorzeny had requested American tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and Jeeps. What he received was a handful of each, barely enough to equip a small unit rather than the brigade-sized force originally envisioned. Only one American Sherman tank was located in all of Germany. Engineers were forced to disguise German Panther tanks as American M10 tank destroyers, a deception that fooled no one up close. The Jeep teams fared better, if only because Jeeps were easier to capture and conceal. Several dozen English-speaking German commandos headed behind enemy lines in early December 1944, driving captured jeeps and wearing American uniforms. Their mission was to disrupt supply convoys, destroy road signs, cut telephone cables, and spread confusion through false orders and rumors. Some teams achieved remarkable results. One cut a communication cable linking General Courtney Hodges' headquarters with General Omar Bradley's command post, disrupting communications for several hours at a critical moment. Other teams laid minefields, felled trees, and posed as American military police directing units in wrong directions. The psychological impact of Operation Greif far exceeded its military effectiveness. Rumors spread through American lines that thousands of German infiltrators were operating behind the front, that Skorzeny himself was leading a team to assassinate General Eisenhower. Roadblocks multiplied across the rear areas. Passwords were changed constantly. Military police stopped every vehicle and interrogated drivers with questions about American culture, baseball statistics, state capitals, movie stars. The paranoia reached absurd levels. American soldiers began shooting at other American soldiers who gave incorrect answers to improvised quiz questions. General Omar Bradley himself was detained at one checkpoint when he correctly identified Springfield as the capital of Illinois, which the military policeman believed was wrong. The chaos demonstrated something that German commanders found both encouraging and deeply troubling. American logistics depended on free movement across vast networks of roads. Anything that slowed that movement, that introduced doubt and friction into the system, would degrade American combat effectiveness. But the flip side of this observation was equally significant. American logistics functioned at such high efficiency that even massive disruption could only produce temporary effects. Within days, the paranoia faded. The roadblocks were removed. The supply convoys resumed their relentless movement, and the German offensive, starved of fuel and ammunition, ground to a halt. The largest jeep team tell that American counterintelligence discovered was subtle but revealing. German jeeps almost always carried 4 men. American jeeps almost never carried more than 3. The Germans, trained in a military culture where every resource was maximized, instinctively packed their vehicles to capacity. Americans, with access to virtually unlimited vehicles, spread their personnel across more machines. This tiny detail, insignificant in itself, illustrated the fundamental asymmetry that doomed German logistics. German planners were constantly trying to do more with less, squeezing every possible ounce of utility from limited resources. American planners operated with abundance, accepting inefficiencies that shocked German observers because the cost of those inefficiencies was irrelevant compared to the benefits of simplicity and speed. The Eastern Front revealed German logistical inadequacy on a scale that North Africa only hinted at. When Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, the Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union with approximately 3 million soldiers, 600,000 vehicles of various types, and 750,000 horses. The balance between motorized and horse-drawn transport reflected German industrial limitations and doctrinal assumptions. German strategists expected a short war, a lightning campaign that would crush Soviet resistance before winter. Horses and rail lines, supplemented by trucks, would suffice for a conflict measured in weeks. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Soviet distances shattered German logistics within months of the invasion. The Wehrmacht advanced so rapidly in the opening weeks that supply lines stretched to breaking. Infantry divisions marched faster than horse-drawn wagons could follow. Panzer units outran their fuel supplies. Ammunition convoys became stuck in mud that hardened into frozen ruts that shattered axles. The Soviet rail network presented a problem German planners had anticipated but grossly underestimated. Russian tracks used a different gauge than European railways, meaning German trains could not operate on captured lines without extensive conversion work. The Reichsbahn, Germany's civilian railway administration, did not cooperate smoothly with the Wehrmacht, creating bureaucratic conflicts that delayed critical shipments. Army rail teams were inexperienced, undermanned, and poorly equipped to convert track gauges while simultaneously repairing infrastructure sabotaged by retreating Soviet forces and harassed by partisan attacks. By October 1941, Army Group South was immobilized because only 48% of their trucks remained operational. Between October 17th and 20th, no supplies reached frontline units at all. Troops were forced to live off the land, seizing food from a civilian population that had little to spare. From November 9th through 23rd, only one fuel train reached the 9th Army, and the contents could not be distributed because the trucks meant to carry it forward had empty tanks themselves. The fuel crisis that paralyzed German operations in Russia would recur throughout the war, in North Africa, in Italy, in France. German tactical brilliance repeatedly outran German logistical capacity. Rommel's legendary desert offensives collapsed not because British soldiers outfought German soldiers, but because German tanks ran out of fuel while British supply lines, secured by Mediterranean naval power and fed by American production, kept the Eighth Army fighting. During Case Blue, the German offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields in 1942, the length of the advance created chronic supply difficulties. The Black Sea was too dangerous for supply ships. Fuel had to come by rail through Rostov or be flown in by the Luftwaffe. Panzer divisions sometimes sat immobile for weeks, waiting for fuel that trickled forward in quantities insufficient for sustained operations. The irony was savage. Germany was attacking toward oil fields precisely because it lacked the petroleum to fight a long war, but the attack itself consumed fuel at rates that exhausted reserves before the objective could be reached. American industrial production presented German planners with an impossible equation. In 1941, the United States manufactured more than 3 million automobiles for civilian use. When America entered the war, this capacity redirected almost entirely to military production. Chrysler built aircraft fuselages. Ford constructed tanks. Automotive plants across the country produced trucks, jeeps, artillery, and ammunition in quantities that German intelligence officers found difficult to believe. Over the course of the war, the United States produced approximately 2,382,000 military trucks against German production of approximately 166,000. American factories built 100,000 fighter aircraft. German factories produced 30,000. The disparity extended to every category of equipment, from machine guns to cargo ships. American logistics was built on a foundation of industrial capacity that Germany simply could not match, even had German planners recognized the importance of logistics from the beginning. This is why German generals examining captured jeeps experienced something more profound than technical curiosity. They were confronting the physical evidence of their strategic defeat. The jeep was not a wonder weapon in any conventional sense. It mounted no cannon. It carried no armor. A rifle bullet could disable it as easily as it could disable any unprotected vehicle. But the jeep represented a way of thinking about war that Germany had rejected. German military culture glorified the decisive battle, the brilliant maneuver, the warrior spirit that could overcome material disadvantages through superior tactics and courage. American military culture, inheriting the lessons of the Civil War and the First World War, understood that modern warfare was fundamentally about logistics. The army that could move more supplies faster to more places would eventually grind down any opponent, regardless of how many individual battles that opponent might win. The Jeep was designed to be produced by workers with minimal training, using materials that were abundant in America. The Go Devil engine, a cast iron 4-cylinder block, could be manufactured with conventional machine tools. The body panels were stamped from flat steel sheets, requiring no specialized forming equipment. The electrical system was simple enough that a farmer's son with basic mechanical aptitude could diagnose and repair problems in the field. Every aspect of the design prioritized production over performance, maintainability over sophistication. German engineers, trained in a tradition that valued precision and complexity, found this philosophy almost offensive. How could such a crude machine be effective? The answer was that effectiveness in warfare is not determined by the performance of individual machines, but by the number of functioning machines available at the point of decision. A technically superior vehicle that breaks down, that cannot be repaired, that cannot be replaced, contributes nothing to victory. A simple vehicle that runs, that can be fixed, that arrives in overwhelming numbers, wins wars. The Jeep's versatility extended far beyond basic transportation. American forces adapted the vehicle for roles its designers never anticipated. Equipped with machine guns, the Jeep became an improvised combat vehicle for reconnaissance and pursuit operations. Fitted with radios, it became a mobile command post. Mounted with stretchers, it evacuated wounded from positions that conventional ambulances could not reach. Signal Corps units used Jeeps to lay communication cables across rough terrain. Engineers drove them into minefields to scout routes. Commanders traveled in them to forward observation posts. The single design filled dozens of functions that the German military addressed with separate specialized vehicles, each with its own supply chain, training requirements, and maintenance procedures. This versatility was not a designed feature so much as a consequence of the Jeep's fundamental simplicity. A basic chassis with good mobility could be adapted to almost any purpose by soldiers with imagination and necessity. German tactical reports from Tunisia noted a critical observation that would prove prophetic. The Jeep allowed American commanders to make decisions and implement them immediately. A German commander who wanted to personally assess a situation at the front faced a journey of hours by horse-drawn vehicle or staff car limited to roads. An American commander jumped into a Jeep and was there in minutes, regardless of terrain. This speed of command translated directly into tactical responsiveness. American units could react to changing situations faster than German units, not because American soldiers were quicker or braver, but because American officers had the mobility to see situations firsthand and give orders on the spot. The Jeep democratized battlefield awareness, putting every officer in direct contact with the fighting front. German headquarters, by contrast, relied on reports that were often hours old by the time they arrived, leading to decisions based on situations that had already changed. The German procurement system compounded the problems created by industrial limitations. While American war production was coordinated through centralized agencies that prioritized standardization and efficiency, German production was fractured among competing power centers. The Army, Navy, Luftwaffe, and SS each maintained separate supply organizations that often worked at cross purposes. Albert Speer's reforms after 1942 improved efficiency somewhat, but fundamental problems remained. Skilled workers were drafted into the military, while factories relied increasingly on forced labor, which inevitably included sabotage as an act of resistance. Quality control declined as materials grew scarce and supervision became inadequate. German tanks and vehicles produced in 1944 and 45 were notably less reliable than earlier models, even as Allied production reached its peak efficiency. Consider the contrast between the German Tiger tank and the American Jeep as expressions of industrial philosophy. The Tiger was a masterpiece of military engineering, arguably the finest heavy tank of the war. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a mile. Its armor could shrug off most Allied anti-tank weapons, but the Tiger required skilled mechanics to maintain and consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. Germany built fewer than 1,400 Tigers during the entire war. Each one was precious, irreplaceable, a resource that commanders hoarded rather than risked. The Jeep, by contrast, was expendable. If one broke down beyond field repair, soldiers stripped useful parts and left the carcass. Another Jeep would arrive soon enough. American logistics treated vehicles as consumables rather than assets, an approach that horrified German officers raised in a culture of material scarcity, but that proved devastatingly effective. The flow of American equipment to Allied forces through Lend-Lease demonstrated the scale of American production advantage. Nearly 50,000 quarter-ton Jeeps were shipped to the Soviet Union, along with vast quantities of trucks, aircraft, and other equipment. The British received Jeeps by the tens of thousands. Free French, Polish, and other Allied forces all equipped themselves with American vehicles. Canada, whose industrial contribution is often overlooked, produced more than 800,000 military trucks during the war, exceeding the combined truck production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allied war effort was fundamentally an industrial war effort, and the Axis powers were outproduced on every front. It is worth pausing here to consider why German planners, who were not stupid men, failed to recognize the importance of logistics until it was too late. The answer lies partly in institutional culture and partly in the experience of the First World War. German military thinking between the wars focused intensely on avoiding the stalemate of the trenches. Mobility, surprise, concentration of force at decisive points, these were the principles that drove German tactical innovation. The Blitzkrieg doctrine that shocked the world in Poland and France represented the culmination of this thinking, using tanks and aircraft to shatter enemy formations before they could organize coherent defenses. But Blitzkrieg assumed short wars. It assumed that decisive battles would end conflicts before logistics became limiting. Against Poland, which fell in weeks, this assumption held. Against France, which surrendered in 6 weeks, it held again. Against the Soviet Union, which refused to collapse, the assumption proved fatal. We have examined how equipment choices reflect deeper strategic realities, how industrial capacity translates into battlefield advantage, and how doctrine shapes the design of weapons. These connections are the core of understanding military history, beyond the surface level of battles and generals. If this approach to history resonates with you, subscribing to the channel ensures you will not miss future explorations of these themes. The fate of German logistics in the final years of the war illustrates what happens when an army ignores industrial reality. Allied strategic bombing targeted German transportation infrastructure with devastating effect. Rail yards were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Fuel plants were hit repeatedly, cutting the aviation, gasoline, and diesel that kept German vehicles and aircraft operational. By 1945, German units were sometimes immobilized entirely by lack of fuel. Tiger and Panther tanks, fearsome in combat, sat useless beside roads while their crews walked toward prisoner-of-war camps. The massive investment Germany had made in quality over quantity proved worthless when those quality vehicles could not move. American logistics, by contrast, reached its peak efficiency in 1944 and 45. The Red Ball Express and other dedicated supply routes pushed enormous tonnages from Normandy beaches to frontline units. Trucks ran continuously, headlights on despite blackout regulations, because getting supplies forward mattered more than concealment. When vehicles broke down, maintenance units repaired them or replaced them from stocks that seemed inexhaustible to German observers. American units advanced knowing that fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement equipment would follow. German units advanced knowing that every kilometer carried them further from resupply that might never arrive. The Jeep, that small and simple vehicle that German generals came to admire, embodied the American approach to industrialized warfare. It was not the best vehicle Germany could have built. Germany produced excellent light vehicles, reliable and sophisticated machines that performed well in testing, but German industry could not produce those vehicles in numbers sufficient to equip the Wehrmacht. American industry could produce Jeeps by the hundreds of thousands and did. The lesson German generals drew from captured Jeeps was not about engineering, but about economics. They realized too late that they were fighting a war of production against an enemy that outproduced them in every category. After the war, American historian Hugh Cole interviewed numerous German officers for the official Army history of the European theater. When asked which American equipment they most admired, German generals repeatedly named the Jeep, not the Sherman tank, though they respected its reliability, not the P-51 Mustang, though they feared its reach, not the artillery, though they acknowledged its accuracy. The Jeep. They called it the Wonder Wagon, and they meant it without irony. The Jeep had demonstrated something they had not previously understood about modern warfare. Victory belonged not to the army with the best weapons, but to the army that could put good enough weapons everywhere they needed to be. The captured Jeeps that German units operated as prizes became symbols of both admiration and frustration. German commanders who experienced the vehicle's capabilities firsthand understood what their own logistics lacked, but understanding did not translate into solutions. German industry could not be reorganized mid-war. German doctrine could not be fundamentally revised while fighting on multiple fronts. German officers could only adapt within constraints that grew tighter each year. Some units painted captured Jeeps with German markings and operated them until they broke down or ran out of fuel. Others stripped them for parts. A few ended up in museums or private collections after the war, their German camouflage paint preserved as historical curiosities. Each one represented a small moment of clarity for German officers who briefly experienced what American logistics made possible. The strategic implications extended beyond the Second World War. Post-war American military doctrine embraced the lessons of wartime logistics with renewed intensity. Standardization became a governing principle. Interoperability between services and allies shaped equipment design. The Jeep itself continued in military service for decades, evolving through various models while maintaining its fundamental character as a simple, reliable, versatile vehicle that could be produced in vast numbers. Modern military logistics, with its containerized shipping and standardized equipment, traces directly to principles proven in the supply lines of 1944. Germany's defeat was overdetermined. Even with perfect logistics, the Reich faced enemies with greater population, more natural resources, and deeper industrial capacity. But the margin of German defeat was shaped significantly by logistical failures that better planning might have mitigated. An army that could have kept more vehicles running, that could have moved supplies faster, that could have reduced the burden of horse transport, might have prolonged the war even if it could not have won it. The Jeep stands as a physical reminder of choices not made, priorities not set, investments not pursued. German engineering brilliance produced tanks that terrified Allied crews and aircraft that pushed the boundaries of aviation technology. That same engineering culture could not produce a simple, reliable manufacturable vehicle in quantities sufficient for modern warfare. When that German logistics officer stood over a captured Jeep in Tunisia, examining its simple engine and basic components, he recognized something his superiors still refused to accept. The war would be decided not in the factories producing Tiger tanks, but in the factories producing Jeeps and trucks and cargo ships. It would be decided not by the courage of individual soldiers, but by the caloric intake of those soldiers and the ammunition in their magazines. It would be decided by which side could move more material, more reliably, to more places. Standing there in the North African sun, surrounded by the evidence of American industrial might, he understood that Germany had already lost the war. The fighting would continue for 2 more years, killing millions more soldiers and civilians. But the outcome was determined by factors that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The Jeep remains one of the most recognizable vehicles in history. Its descendants still bear the name, though modern Jeeps share little with their wartime ancestors beyond a general rugged appearance. The legacy of the original quarter-ton 4x4 extends far beyond brand recognition. It demonstrated principles of military procurement that remain relevant today. Simplicity enables production. Standardization enables maintenance. Reliability matters more than peak performance. These lessons, learned in blood across European and Pacific battlefields, continue to shape how militaries around the world equip themselves for war. The German generals who admired the Wonder Wagon were recognizing something fundamental about industrial-age warfare, and their recognition came too late. This is how history works at its most profound level. Small decisions about vehicle design, manufacturing priorities, and doctrine compound over years into strategic advantages or disadvantages that prove decisive. The generals and admirals who command armies and fleets work within constraints established years before any battle is fought. The engineers and factory managers who build military equipment shape the wars those weapons will fight. The politicians and planners who allocate resources between competing priorities determine whether armies will advance or starve. The Jeep was just a vehicle, but it was also a symbol of everything Germany lacked and America possessed. When German generals finally understood what that small, simple machine represented, they understood why their supply lines had failed, why their offensives had stalled, and why their war was lost. Thank you for watching this deep exploration of how logistics shaped the Second World War. If you found value in understanding the connection between seemingly minor equipment choices and strategic outcomes, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. The stories of military history contain lessons that resonate far beyond the battlefields where they unfolded, and future videos will continue to examine those lessons in detail. Until then, remember that wars are won not just by soldiers who fight, but by the systems that keep them fighting.